Good morning, everyone. I'm Lynn Holtain. Welcome to the Victoria Law Foundation's Research Network event on real-life research in partnership, understanding civil law needs of older people and building research capacity in CLCs. I will introduce you to all our speakers in just a moment, but first, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am this morning, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and it is my enormous privilege to recognise their abiding connection to this land, its waterways and community, and also recognise that the lands were never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders and to all the generations who have nurtured this land for over 50,000 years and continue to do so. We believe that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a better, more equitable future, and we recognise the impact of colonisation, its legacy of injustice, and the marginalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. At the Victoria Law Foundation, we aim to break down the barriers to justice for all Victorians through our work in research, education and grants. We're committed to making a sincere and positive contribution to a better justice system for all of us, particularly those who are vulnerable and most in need. So welcome once again to our final Research Network event for 2021. Let me just run you through a few housekeeping matters before we proceed. You will notice already that only panelists can be seen and heard in this webinar. So all of you as attendees have your videos turned off and your audio is muted, but please take the opportunity to say good day to all your fellow attendees through the chat function and to make any comments as the discussion proceeds, and use the Q&A function to ask questions or to upvote other people's questions that you're interested in hearing response to. There'll be time to get to the questions at the end of the presentations. You'll also be aware, I think, that we're recording this session, so if you'd like to see it again or send it off to your friends and family for viewing, then we will distribute it after the event, and you're very, very welcome to spread it far and wide. Our speakers today are Alexandria Jones from the Barwon Community Legal Service, Ian Warren from Deakin University, and three members of the Deakin University Student Research Panel in Justin Boxall, Shannon Fenn and Jordan Galbraith. Let me just give you a little bit more detail on those speakers before we introduce you to Nigel Balmer, our Research Director. Alexandria Jones is a lawyer and a community legal educator. She's the Community Development Manager at Bowen and leads the CLE and Community Development Practice. She oversees a range of projects aimed at improving access to justice for people living in the Bowen region. Alex has significant experience working with the social justice sectors, both in Victoria and the Northern Territory, and for the past 3 years has convened the Barwon Elder Abuse Primary Prevention Network, and we'll hear from Alexandria in a moment or two. Ian Warren is a senior lecturer in criminology at Deakin, Waurn Ponds, extensive experience in designing and implementing criminology curricula and encouraging students, most interestingly in this context, to apply their theoretical knowledge to real-world situations. He's worked on a number of research projects that question the operation of applied law in the fields of international and transnational crime and public administrative law. More recently, his work examines comparative approaches to understanding freedom of information law and the role of technology in legal decision-making, a very hot topic. And joining us from Deakin, the University Student Research Panel, Justin Boxall and Shannon Fenn are both fourth-year Criminology Psychological Science students, and Jordan Galbraith is in his fourth year of Criminology Forensic Science degree. So right on point for this morning's conversation. To introduce the topic and give you some context around this discussion, let me pass now to Nigel Balmer, our esteemed Research Director. And don't forget, we'll have Q&A time at the end, so hold all your questions and put them in the chat, in the Q&A function rather, and I'll see you again at the end of the presentations. Nigel.
Thanks, Lynn. So our previous research network events have included a broad range of speakers from community legal sector, from legal aid, and from academia, both here and further afield. Today's session presents what I think is a pretty fascinating collaboration between Barwon Community Legal Service and Deakin University, as Lynn mentioned. It's also the first project funded by a VLF knowledge grant to be presented at one of these sessions. So knowledge grants are still a relatively new program for the VLF. They began in 2019. And the principle behind them is essentially to try and help community legal organizations undertake a research project to improve knowledge about legal need, while also trying to develop research skills or data collection systems. And I think they've been a key part of integrating our also pretty new research function at the VLF and ensuring our aims in research, education, and grants are all working together to support better justice. They also kind of speak to my own core aims as an empirical legal researcher to try and ensure we understand people's needs and capabilities by engaging those people and trying to enable policy and service design to be made from the bottom up, so reflecting these needs and capabilities. It's become kind of a cliche in empirical access to justice research, but one size doesn't fit all. And finding out the size that does fit means you have to do some measurements sometimes, you have to tailor things, you have to sometimes try things on. And the aim of knowledge grants is to try and help organizations along that journey in a small way. And I think this project's a really excellent example. So as Lynn mentioned, it's about the civil law needs of older people, and importantly, how Bowen might be able to improve its services to address need in light of findings. Hugh MacDonald, our principal researcher, and I met with Alexandria Ian and a number of the Deakin students who've been working on the project a little while ago, and we were both really excited about the project's collaborative approach. And we'll hear more about that from Alexandria Ian, Justin, Jordan, and Shannon, who've been working on the project. But the subject matter is also really important, and I thought I'd just briefly show you why that's the case from a legal need perspective. So I'll just show you a quick slide. So hopefully you can now see that. Okay, so this is how most legal needs surveys view age, right? So you've got more problems on the left and then age going up. And it's essentially related to stages of life. So as you buy stuff, rent houses, get married, have children, buy a load of stuff on the internet, which is mainly what I do, you have more problems. So you can see me right in the high risk area there. As you get older, people do less of this, so they're fine. And that's pretty much been the legal need discourse for some time. And it's kind of not good enough. The story was never enough. And the reality is that in a lot of this research, older people are overlooked. They can be missing from sample frames. So for example, where they're care home residents, they can be subject to research approaches that make it difficult for them to participate or discourage trust. So for example, a cold call from a market research company. They're also often not engaged. So you can ask the wrong questions that don't really apply to people's lives. And methodologically, much like services, one size doesn't fit all. So research that's not tailored to experience, or research that acknowledges that not everything's a problem. Some things are just an issue. So some things happen, like retirement, housing, care decisions, wills and probate, but they still very much have a legal context around them. And stories can be too simplistic as well. So it's not just about problem prevalence, it's also around issues of access, accessibility, perceptions of problems, perceptions of services, trust and broader legal capabilities. All of these things matter. But the key message is older people are often missing from this discourse, and tailored and focused projects like this at least go some way to trying to address this. And at that point, I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to Alex, Ian, and the Deakin students. If I can work out how to stop sharing, we go. Over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. I just want to check that everyone can see my slides. I'm hoping that they're good to go and everyone can hear me. Lovely. So thanks, Nigel, for that introduction, and thank you, Lynn. I too also want to acknowledge country, and as we gather virtually this morning on Aboriginal land from across Victoria and perhaps beyond, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Wadawurrung country, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. On the screen is a beautiful piece of art from a local Wadawurrung artist, Billy J. O'Toole, entitled Bowen, and that means place of resting by the fire, and Ballerine is part of the Bowen catchment. So I'd like to extend my acknowledgement also to the country on which you are all on today, and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which you are on, country that is stolen and sovereignty has never been ceded. So we feel pretty honoured actually to be presenting as part of the Victoria Law Foundation Research Network on our knowledge building project. And while our research project was in the end pretty humble in scope and findings, we hope you leave today, especially if you're working in a community-based organisation like a CLC, with the knowledge that even in an under-resourced environment, even during a pandemic, that by working in partnership, you can build a sustainable research program, which can help you better understand priority client groups and areas of legal need. And as Nigel really powerfully demonstrated as well, I think the theme that really wove through our research was this theme of ageism. And I think if you're currently working with vulnerable communities, in a community organisation in particular, I hope that today's presentation really prompts some reflection on how your organisation connects with older people.
Sorry, Alex, can I just interrupt quickly? We can actually see your speaking notes. They're covering the presentation slides.
Sorry.
That's much better. Thank you.
Oh, that's a Zoom rookie mistake. And I want you to reflect on how your organisation connects with older people and how they might be accessing your service and the invisible barriers that might be there that are impacting that. So just a little bit of context about Barwon Community Legal to provide you some context for our presentation today. So we are a generalist service, civil law service, and our work includes legal assistance, social work support, community development, law reform and advocacy. In terms of our catchment, we cover the Bowen region, which includes Ballerine, Surf Coast, Colac, Otway, and we extend down to Colac and Apollo Bay. As well as our civil generalist practice, we also provide the applicant family violence intervention duty lawyer service at both Geelong and Colac Magistrates Court. And I also want to preface today's presentation with the fact that we actually designed our research questions and project model in a pre-COVID world. So while we were able to pivot and adapt and understand our research in the context of the pandemic, the two seeds of inspiration that actually inspired this research project were in a world where COVID didn't exist, but it's still very relevant today. So the first seed of inspiration was that we really noticed in our family violence practice an increase in legal demand for our services. Most recent data, so in a COVID world, showed that 58% of our current legal assistance is family violence related. And so we were really wondering, you know, how older people are accessing our family violence services. The second seed, which really motivated this research project, was that we convened the Barwon Elder Abuse Primary Prevention Network. So we work together with organisations within our region to really try to stop elder abuse before it begins. And I was really keen to get a sense of the prevalence data in our region and noted that at Bcls, we didn't really have a system in place that captured elder abuse cases. And so that really showed to us that there was this need for research, and it inspired us to apply for the knowledge grant through BLF. I think also in terms of the need, it's clear that we really don't have an established evidence base to really understand how family violence impacts older people. It's estimated up to 14% of older people may experience elder abuse. We also saw the complexity of these cases, and that often in anecdotal information from our lawyers and from other stakeholders, people really saw this issue as a family issue and not a legal issue. Elder abuse also spans really diverse areas of civil law. So an older person could walk through our doors with a credit debt or consumer issue, which actually could be an elder abuse issue as well. And there are big non-legal factors that impact this, such as health, housing, mobility, isolation. In particular, in our region in Barwon, we also have an ageing population that's expected to significantly increase. And this is an ageing population that's actually higher than metropolitan Melbourne. So 31.4% of our population in 2016 were in the over 55 category. So in light of this, we thought it's essential that CLCs and other service providers in our region really are better equipped to identify and respond to the civil law needs of older people, particularly at a critical time during a pandemic. We had actually also never done a research project before. So the Knowledge Grant was a real opportunity to dedicate some resourcing and some time to allow us to kind of look into these issues, because time is often a luxury that we just don't have in community legal centres. So we aimed to understand the following. We wanted a new understanding of civil law needs of older people. We wanted to understand the barriers that were preventing them accessing legal assistance. We wanted to look at the referral pathways, where the gaps were, as well as finding a way to incorporate some of our research findings into real life practice, into our legal service, and improving some of our data collection and how we're categorising files. In terms of scope, we defined older person as someone who is 60 years and over, and 50 years and over for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, in recognition for the gap in life expectancy that still exists to this day. We looked at a 3-year period, and in terms of the partnership, we divided our research into 2 stages. So we had 2 cohorts of students from which you will hear today, and phase 1 looked within at our own data to try to understand how we were servicing older people, what the met need was. And phase 2 was looking outside of our organisation at external data and focus groups with key stakeholders. We were guided by a project advisory group, which was a really important part of this research project, and that involved Seniors Rights Victoria, Victoria Police, Victoria Legal Aid, our local multicultural council, Diversitat, and Bowen Health. I'll now hand over to Dr. Ian Warren to provide some key learnings around the impacts of ethics approval, which was a huge learning curve for us, and some really practical advice for anyone, particularly community organisations who are thinking about conducting research.
Thanks, Alex. And I'd just like to thank the Victorian Law Foundation as well for all their assistance throughout the project, because obviously with COVID, we had various hurdles that we had to comply with from a university perspective, but also because the partnership idea was very new to the university, the ethics approval process was quite difficult. And as a consequence, we had to adapt our thinking in light of some of the risk factors that were identified by the ethics committee in the Faculty of Arts and Education here at Deakin. So as we sort of went through the processes that we had to go through with Deakin, it became apparent that Deakin systems were built on approving research for Deakin rather than acknowledging that BCLS actually owned the data that it wanted to audit. And so there was this question of ownership that was constantly coming up, and we actually had to do some negotiation with the ethics committee to encourage them to understand that it was actually BCLS's project, and they didn't come under a pre-existing ethics arrangement from any other organisation. So so Deakin could not own the data or insist that it was stored on Deakin systems and so forth. So it was a little bit challenging, I think, at both fronts in terms of understanding how the research project would operate. As a consequence, the research questions were basically framed around what are BCLS's recording practices and how can these be improved to promote evidence-based approaches to dealing with the legal needs of older people. And then as a subset of that, what are the views of key agencies in the region about identifying elder abuse, identifying civil law needs of older people, providing assistance for older people, and BCLS's roles in the area. Now, one key thing that you will see there is that there's no direct consultation with older people themselves. If there was, that would put the ethics process into a high risk category, and that would automatically blow the project out between 3 and 8 months. Now, we started the ethics process prior to COVID. We went for a low risk application, and as a consequence of going for the low risk application, we had to concede that we couldn't interview older people directly. And as it turned out, COVID kind of cushioned that a little bit, because one of the things in the literature on elder abuse and civil law needs of older people relates to the problem that older people have a lack of access to digital technology anyway. So effectively what COVID did was push all of the data collection online, for good or bad. There were certain limitations to that process. But I'd also like to suggest that that issue of not being able to interview older people was also a product of the high risk factors associated with the terms elder abuse, and potentially dealing with vulnerable populations. So I think COVID sort of lets us off the hook on that issue, but it's something for further research down the track, I think, to actually interview older people about their experiences, for good or bad, in terms of accessing the law and civil law need directly. And so we put in the low risk ethics form. That was approved after 3 goes. So there was a lot of negotiation with the ethics committee there. There was also no travel permitted due to COVID for obvious reasons. So it was basically a fully online project. I've mentioned the issue with the BCLS files, but sometimes the university ethics committees need to recognise with the partnership model that you're dealing with data that is owned by other organisations. So it should remain within their purview. All of our students were covered by ethics approval and were supervised directly by BCLS and Deakin. So there was 2 sets of supervision during the course of the process. And finally, we also applied for Victoria Police Ethics to interview a few police officers down here that had experience dealing with issues related to older people, but they knocked back our ethics request as well. So I think it's a lesson to be thinking about planning the ethics approval process early in order to offset some of these difficulties. The law enforcement one doesn't particularly surprise me, but it was certainly disappointing given that we had 3 police officers that were willing to talk. So it's just one of those things that we needed to cut out of the project. Now, in terms of the literature, there's actually quite a bit of emerging literature on elder abuse per se, but not a lot on civil law need. And one of the running processes that we worked through during the project was that failure to address civil law need has the potential to magnify the prospect of elder abuse. So this is a question that sort of drove our thinking and is certainly something to build on for future studies of the similar nature. What we've identified is that financial, psychological, and physical aspects of elder abuse are widely underreported. Potentially up to 20% of people aged 65 and over, or 55 and over for ATSI people, might experience some of these forms of abuse during the course of their aging. And what we also found is that most policies raise awareness of issues which is a term that we use in criminological circles called responsibilisation. So they raise awareness amongst particular communities of the need to deal with particular problems rather than providing the actual help. And so there's that sense to which this project was really important for going that next step and identifying methods of trying to improve the help that is available for older people that might experience some of these problems. There was a major Australian Law Reform Commission report in 2017 which identified several problems that might have magnified the civil law problems that older people face, including lack of independent legal advice, financial abuse, and that would occur not only through scams and so forth, but problems with wills and misuses of powers of attorney, generally by younger family relatives. There's also problems that older people face negotiating Centrelink and Social Security, and that now extends into the NDIS and other healthcare areas. There's a growing literature on consumer scams and the importance of consumer protection law, particularly with more older people going online and not necessarily knowing what a scam looks like and how to identify it. In Geelong and the surrounding region, we also know anecdotally that there's a lot of isolation and lack of mobility in transport, particularly the further out you move from the Geelong area, the public transport starts to get pretty problematic. And obviously as more services are moving to fully online, there's a presumption that older people actually know how to use the technology. So that's a really important problem that's got broader ramifications in terms of accessing legal services. So what we do in the next part of the presentation, and I'll hand back to Alex in a moment, we described some preliminary findings from online searches, including the Australian Bureau of Statistics and various forms of demographic data about civil law issues associated with older people, particular to this region. We did interviews with 4 BCLS staff about their views on legal need for older people and its links with elder abuse. We then did 13 interviews with key stakeholders. Some of those were done as focus groups, and they were from a diverse range of areas. So they were not necessarily from legal backgrounds, they were from health. Some had provided family violence support. Some were in the field of dementia support, and there were various other services mixed in with that as well. And finally, a small-scale survey where 28 responses were received from local organisations who were engaged with older people in some way. So we're talking Meals on Wheels and other more voluntary services, just on their opinions about some of the issues that we've covered from the literature and the core questions. So I'll hand over to Alex now to start going.
Thanks, Ian. I want to start with our quantitative data, as that was definitely the most challenging to really understand and unpack. And I also want to preface our preliminary findings with the fact that class has many limitations. And I know for many CLC colleagues who have the privilege of dealing with class, it can be a very challenging data system. So there are many kind of internal and external factors that impact our own data. And I think that's why having the qualitative data to kind of inform and help tell the story that our data is telling us is so important. But we examined our own data looking at a 3-year period, and the theme that also interwove our research was this lack of definition of what an older person actually is. And I think for us, we defined an older person as 60 plus because we looked to our specialist community legal centre in Victoria, Seniors Rights Victoria, and really looked at how they engage with older people and what age they defined older persons. So we did use that as a guide, and that was challenging in terms of looking at class, because when we looked within our class system, we saw that our age categories didn't necessarily align with that. So we had to do quite complex reports looking at our own data. When we looked at clients, we only looked at full clients. So we didn't include clients who were calling us just for information or referrals. So they were clients who actually received a legal assistance or a legal service from us. And we also excluded that triage information or referral support as part of that service. So what did our data tell us? Well, what we could glean from our data is that around 10% of older people in our region with potential legal needs are coming to our service. So 12% of services were delivered to 749 older people, representing about 14% of all our clients over that 3-year period. You'll hear from Jordan, one of our research interns, a little bit later on, looking at some of the demographic data, and it's estimated that around 7,220 older people within our region have potential legal needs. So that just puts some of our data in context. We also found out that services have increased to older people over time, which was an interesting finding given that a period of our data was impacted by COVID and that services were delivered online for some of that time. And the number of clients of older people has remained relatively stable. We also found out that older people are much more likely to receive a higher level of legal assistance from us in terms of casework support. So 23% of legal assistance for older people was provided as an ongoing legal casework compared with services to other cohorts of clients, which was only 10%. And in terms of the most common legal problem types, family violence was definitely the most common. And that was closely followed by traffic and vehicle regulatory offences, and then wills and related legal problems. In terms of our client profile, so who was accessing our service, I think the big thing that we really noticed was that we had very, very limited numbers of older Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients accessing our service. So only 0.2% of services were delivered to 13 older people across a 3-year period. We also found that quite a large proportion of our clients had a family violence indicator, and also that many came to us reporting that they're living with a disability. Notably, 10 out of 13 of our Aboriginal clients we assisted reported a disability. 40% of older clients who received services from us were on the age pension, and just over 10% in receipt of disability support pension. I'll just note that also we are a community legal centre that provides Centrelink support and social security assistance, and that's quite a specialised area of law, and not every single community legal centre does that. So that's something to note. And also 75% of older clients we assisted did live within our region, but only 5% of older people from the Colac-Otway region were really accessing our services. Limitations to our data and what it's not telling us. I think, as I noted before, there's a real challenge with this definition of older person, and also the differing definition we use for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients made the reports quite complex. There was also a huge data gap around a client location. So there was quite a large proportion of clients where we were unsure where they were from, but they were still accessing our service. And there are also some indicators that were just very hard to measure looking at our data alone. So they related to mobility and digital access, so how older people were accessing us. So in terms of painting a bit more of a fulsome picture and providing some context to this data to help it tell its story, I'll pass on to one of our knowledge building interns, Shannon, who'll provide an overview of the BCLS staff focus group findings and a bit of a thematic analysis.
Thanks, Alex. So during the research process, multiple interviews were conducted with BCLS staff members to gain insight into their expertise and also provide a more in-depth understanding to the data that had been analysed. After the 5 interviews that were conducted, we formulated a document that listed all of the key themes and consistencies noted by the staff. So the first major theme was how BCLS defines elder abuse and an older person. So BCLS does not have an explicit definition of elder abuse, nor is this term used as a classification within their database. Rather, BCLS collects the date of birth of every client and classifies data in accordance with legal problem types such as wills and consumer or debt problems. This is primarily because elder abuse was seen as existing on a spectrum that encompasses a variety of factors and largely depends on the specific circumstances of an individual. The dangers of having an overly narrow definition were also noted, and that abuse often overlaps with other legal areas such as family violence. In particular, one staff member stated that we want to help people with as many problems as they've got, some of which will be elder abuse issues, but older people have the same civil issues you and I have at any age. We're just far more holistic. So I think this quote clearly highlights the complexities associated with trying to categorize elder abuse into a single classification. In addition to this, the definition of elder abuse is subjective in nature, further adding to its complexity. Also of note was that BCLS is taking a rights-based approach to classifying elder abuse cases. So that is when elderly people are hindered from accessing their rights, when they are taken advantage of due to their age, or when there are assumptions that due to their age, they have lesser capacity. So another staff member stated that it's all about that rights-based approach. So people being hindered or stopped from accessing their rights, or people just giving the older person's opinion or the older person themselves less weight in a given circumstance and abusing them or taking advantage of them because of their age and making the assumption that because of their age, they're valued less or have less capacity. So the interviews also established that the key civil law issues experienced by older people included family violence, issues with gas and electricity bills, neighbourhood disputes, Centrelink, credit cards and car accidents, and then just some direct quotes on the slides there from staff members as well. We also found a huge reason that elderly people are reluctant to report their abuse is because they're extremely mindful of damaging relationships within their family if a family member is the perpetrator. Additionally, although BCLS's current database does not provide a section to highlight elder abuse, staff indicated that some sort of elder abuse classification that could be embedded into existing law areas would be of benefit for a range of reasons. One staff member stated that it's very subjective to say what's elder abuse and what's not. What we could possibly do is add a category to say that this was a consumer issue and involved elder abuse, or it was a mortgage issue and elder abuse. And so put it as a sort of second subcategory and maybe just flag potential elder abuse or suspected. These factors, alongside issues of access, isolation, mobility and technology, all contributed to a number of civil law issues such as those mentioned in our literature review. While all staff members were in agreement that BCLS does a great job at trying to improve these factors, a number of recommendations were noted. These included, but are not limited to, the development of a health justice partnership, community outreach programs, community education, increased use of social workers, and just a more holistic approach in general when dealing with older clients specifically. Of particular note was the suggestion that if you're looking at what we could improve in the future, it would be great to have a visiting service to an elderly person's home, or we go to them. That's the health justice partnership we're working on with Barwon Health. So we could base a lawyer at the hospital or a health centre one day a week. All staff were in agreement that BCLS is actively pursuing ways to improve outcomes and that the current initiative was a really integral part of the process in identifying areas of most concern. For us, these interviews were a really great way for us to consolidate the research that we had done up until this point, while also providing further insight and knowledge, which ended up contributing to the final product. Now I'll hand over to Justin.
Thanks, Shannon. So continuing with the qualitative data in the research project, another major aspect of the research in the project was reviewing specific BCLS case files that had examples of elder abuse and civil law issues regarding older people. As has been touched on, the BCLS class database has no specific classification for elder abuse, so finding these files was quite difficult. And many examples which would have had elder abuse in the BCLS files would have been missed because of this reason. Instead of elder abuse, some of the classifications that these case files went under included fines, consumer, property matters, and powers of attorney. So some of the consistent findings from the files that we looked at included that nearly all cases had a perpetrator who was a family member who was younger. So this includes sons, daughters, and nephews. However, in a few of the cases, there was also younger family members who were acting as a support for older people regarding their cases. All of the cases investigated involved financial aspect of abuse, whether that be not paying back money owed, stealing money and assets, unknowingly being guarantors on loans that hadn't been paid back, and having their bank accounts controlled by family members. And we'll look at one specific example of Valerie, who is one of the case studies that we looked at. So Valerie is a single mother of 2 children and worked for decades as a nurse to pay off the mortgage on the family home. At 68 years old, her eldest son, Wayne, asked her to invest her superannuation in a business he was setting up. And Valerie felt pressured to help her son, investing most of her account, superannuation, and signing a number of contracts. When the business failed, she discovered that her home was mortgaged under a loan guarantee for $250,000, which she allegedly wasn't correctly informed about, and her home was the only asset that the bank could sell. She came to BCLS for advice about how she could keep her home from being sold by the bank. BCLS looked into the issues, obtained some specialist advice from Consumer Action Law Centre, and assisted Valerie to make a complaint to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, both against the bank and the mortgage broker that Wayne had hired to set up the loan. After 8 months of advocacy and negotiation, AFCA made a determination that the bank had misrepresented the guarantee to the mortgage broker and to Valerie, and that it was therefore completely unenforceable. The determination set Valerie free from a $250,000 financial burden and meant she could keep her home. So this example in particular shows some of the financial aspects, which is really common, that what we found in these case files at BCLS. So one of the barriers that was consistent across the case files was a lack of digital literacy. So this has multiple different impacts, which can lead to examples of financial abuse through exploitation, as well as preventing older people from seeking help in the first place. This was especially prevalent in aged care scenarios. There are examples of older people who did not have their own phone, so could only contact BCLS with the assistance of aged care staff. Another barrier was differing definitions of legal and medical capacity. In one particular example, BCLS were denied access to a client on the grounds of not having medical capacity to make their own decisions, even though legal capacity was the relevant definition to use in this case. And so one of the most consistent themes across the case files was the need for autonomy for older people. Several of the cases involved family members attempting to make decisions that they thought were best for the older person, but in the process, this is actually going against the older person's wishes, even if it may not be seen as the correct decision by others. So in one particular example, family members were trying to protect the client from financial abuse from someone else. However, they were acting against the client's wishes and were therefore actually committing financial abuse themselves. And I think this example shows a really clear picture of the complexity of a lot of these case files and cases of elder abuse. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jordan.
Thanks, Justin, and good morning to everyone tuning in. So part of the research that I looked at really sought to identify the extent of civil law need, barriers, really projected legal need outside of what BCLS was doing. So we consulted a range of publicly available data, but it became pretty obvious quickly that that was going to be limited in answering our specific research question. So for example, Consumer Affairs provided data on the types and number of advices given. We weren't really able to find specific demographic or location data that would provide evidence for the civil law needs of people in the Barwon region. So we really relied on ABS data from the last census to create a bit of a profile of the area. It's definitely worth noting that we're at the end of a census cycle, so were we to do this in the next year or two, this data would likely be a little bit different. But from the data available, we're able to gather that about 55,000 older people live in the Bowen region. The majority of those are in the Greater Geelong area, but it's clear that the Bowen area isn't homogenous. So the proportion of older people range from about 13% in the Lara Grovedale area all the way up to 40% in the Point Lonsdale Queenscliff area. And across that, there's also a range of socioeconomic levels. On average, though, across the area, the older population is a lot greater, is greater than the metro and the rest of regional Victoria proportions by several percent. And the growth of older residents has been greater in the Barwon region compared to elsewhere in Victoria. Approximately 540 people of older people identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. But these are people 50 years and older, and also likely to be more at risk of needing both civil and criminal law help. The areas that had high proportions of older people were also associated with high levels of disability, widowed individuals, and those providing unpaid assistance to person with a disability, so likely family members, close friends. And these are key factors that we identified from the census data that would suggest potential legal need. Sort of the key finding, or a big finding for us, and it's represented in that graph there, that there's more than 12,000 individuals aged 65 and over that live alone in the Bowen area, and more than 1,800 of those live with some sort of disability or impairment. The majority of those, you can see the vast majority reside in the Greater Geelong area. But while like the city of Melbourne, so on the left, has around 60% of the population of Greater Geelong has about 4.5 times the number of older people who live alone, which is just evidence of the greater need to focus on the legal needs of older people within the Barwon region. In addition to that, we looked at the legal needs dashboard from the Law and Justice Foundation, which identified just over 7,000 people who are 65 years and older in the Bowen area that have a predicted need for legal assistance services. So obviously this is a proxy measure and based on income levels and levels of education, and potentially might over or underestimate legal need. When we're comparing around 7,000 individuals to the roughly sort of 100 to 200 older clients serviced each year, there is clearly a gap between the met and the unmet need of legal people in the Barwon region. And as we noticed, or as was noted before, while we were unable to talk with older people in the region to better understand their met and unmet needs, we were able to utilise the knowledge and first-hand accounts of key stakeholders in the area. So I'm just going to throw back to Alex to discuss the stakeholder survey that we conducted.
Thanks, Jordan. Just to inform, I guess, the picture that Jordan's painted around the potential need in our region, legal need and unmet need, this gives you a sense of the top 3 civil law issues that a lot of non-legal services are seeing in their day-to-day work with older people. And overwhelmingly, financial issues, financial abuse was seen as one of the most common, along with Centrelink and wills. So I think these themes were consistent actually with the thematic analysis from our focus groups, as well as from our interviews with Bcls staff. In terms of the stakeholder survey, so that was a survey we conducted via SurveyMonkey. We got 28 respondents, and we targeted people in pretty diverse organisations, so through the library, so librarians who are visiting older people in their homes to deliver library books. Meals on Wheels were a big cohort of people who responded. And as I said before, the main issues that people are seeing relate to financial issues and also around access. Many demonstrated concerns around scams and financial issues, and there was a sense of real confidence in referring the problem to the right person, which was an interesting finding. There was a real, one of the barriers around accessing services was that they thought older people weren't really aware of the services that were available. And one of the suggestions, well, quite a few suggestions were around providing in-person information sessions for older people rather than just relying on online services, which I think is a really important thing to consider, particularly in this post-COVID world where we're really moving a lot of that kind of information and education service online. Now I'll just pass back to Jordan, who will give a bit of a thematic analysis of the focus groups we conducted with some of our stakeholders.
Thanks, Alex. So I was able to conduct focus groups with a range of stakeholders from Dementia Australia, Bethany, Orange Door, Victorian Legal Aid, and a few other organisations. And just some of the key findings, we really tried to sort of delve into barriers. That was sort of where we weren't able to find much specific data. So the focus groups are really useful in addressing this question. So funding was one of the most common barriers that came up. The quote there, I think, highlights a will and desire for greater funding and specific services for older people. However, without that, like, supply just often isn't able to meet the demand, which is mentioned as a barrier for many, not just older people, of course. But there's certainly nothing close to like a panacea for older people in dealing with their range of legal needs. I think that really drives a complexity of the system that is quite fractured and complex for older people to navigate. It's been mentioned a few times already that an older person seeking legal help is rarely experiencing an isolated issue. So that's requiring multiple agencies and services to adequately help them. So for instance, experiencing family violence was often seen as sort of like the trigger point. I did see the Q&A before. Was sort of an initial issue that older people were reaching out for help with, and then it became evident that there were also issues with debt, issues with fines, motor vehicle issues, etc. So this creates gaps where older people are easily able to fall through, and I think that really drives a lack of awareness, not just of the services and how to access them, but awareness of the that an individual is even experiencing legal problems that require legal help. And a real driver of that was noted as societal attitudes, and mainly ageism being a driver of harm. So that ageism demonstrated towards older people, which has traditionally minimized their problems that they may experience, and the importance of I just can't even read what I'm writing. Ageism may not only be a driver of harm, but a cause of legal problems that disempower older people and then being able to access legal help. Family dynamics was a real issue there as well. So while family members may be able to help and empower older people, it was noted that often family members cause barriers. So by subsuming an older person's money, preventing travel, access to services, and then through psychological and physical abuse as well. While also acting as a sense of tension. So driving embarrassment with older people not wanting to cause sort of like a rift or a schism within the family unit, or admit that they've been taken advantage of. So lack of trust was then identified as a real issue. So if sort of family members weren't able to sort of be that support, having other individuals who were trusted, so like GPs or others within the local community, were identified as being really important in being able to identify risk factors and referral pathways, and who can empower older people to identify their legal needs. So it became really clear that these barriers are really interconnected and sort of driving each other, and the pandemic overall has exacerbated these issues, with sort of alternative arrangements being made, legal and medical services being moved to online, increasing isolation, reducing socialization. And this will be particularly impacted. This will particularly impacted older people who are living alone across the Bowen area and who are reliant on family members for care, transport money, all of that. There are, of course, likely to be many more barriers which limit access to justice for older people. And I think further research can be done in this area to identify and develop structures that can overcome these. And with that, I will throw back to Alex and Ian.
In line with the aims of the knowledge grant, there are really two sets of results. And the first relates to BCLS moving towards an evidence-based practice model, because it's clear that they had a lot of data about civil law need for older people, but weren't consolidating it. And that was admitted by all of the staff that were interviewed, and it was admitted by Alex as well, which was the main purpose of the VLF grant. And so one of the things, or there's three things that are coming out of this for BCLS practice. The first is to review and e-mark elder cases involving civil law issues, to enable BCLS to improve outreach and cater for multiple legal problems, including common things that arose from the interviews relating to things like financial problems, scams, and mundane stuff as well. So the literature didn't really point to this, but having, basic utilities turned off, having difficulties accessing welfare and other service provision, keeping in mind that as a generalist legal service, BCLS is also dealing with a lot of disadvantaged people at the same time. So trying to understand and reach out to older people in better ways on the basis of the knowledge that's come out of this project. The second point is to identify and adopt legal health checks for older people around core areas that emerged in the interviews and in the survey data. And the thing that we haven't talked much about, and the next slide will deal with this, the Internship Partnership. I'll go to that in just a minute. But I think, and this builds from the comment that Helen made in the chat that I've been following. Public data sources are all over the place, and they make a lot of assumptions about older people. And again, I noticed that Gary in the Q&A box has mentioned cold people. Now, the data that's publicly available doesn't always identify cold as a specific subgroup, or some data sets will, like the ABS, but others won't. And the problem is that there needs to be a little bit more synthesis that comes out from the discussion about putting civil law need on the table and disassociating it with, in some respects, that the harder edge of abuse, which has been subsumed by family violence. But as was indicated in the chat by Helen, is not always representative of family violence, because it could be committed by tradespeople and other people in power relationships. So there's a need for a broader community-based discussion about some of these issues. There's also the need for a co-care model with health providers and alongside health providers, because they're often the first point of call that older people trust, or that identify particular problems. So working with legal services and healthcare is very, very significant, and BCLS are well underway in doing that, and also considering mobility of services to things like shopping centres and so forth, where older people do go to meet their daily needs. And finally, greater community legal education with older people, including pre-retirement planning and financial literacy. So even starting from the 50s onwards, and ensuring that people are starting to be preventative in that sense, to future-proof their own retirement, which is something that I think all of us should be thinking about before we get to that point. Now, the final issue is, again, a core component of this project was the internship process. And I can speak from an internal Deakin point of view on this one. The internship was one of the most well received within the Faculty of Arts and Education. And I know that in conversations with Alex, they found it refreshing to have a mix of students that were well versed in law. So we had a couple of students that were doing combined law and criminology degrees, but by the same token, they were also very impressed by the skills that people like Justin, Jordan, and Shannon brought from other degrees like psychology and forensic sciences. So you got this mix of empirical skill and problem-solving ability that I think really enhance the entire process. And from our point of view at Deakin, we couldn't be prouder of the way the students acquitted themselves, and the feedback that has come back from Barwon, mainly because this all happened during COVID, and it's one of the hardest educational experiences that all of the interns would have experienced, because they've had no direct contact with lecturing staff, no direct contact with peers, and it just hummed along really, really well. And a lot of that was due to the pastoral care that was provided by the staff at Bcls. So the interns can talk more about this during question time, but we're very proud of the way that this has panned out. And we see that this is an important aspect of the model for the knowledge grant process.
Thanks, Ian. So we might, if we have some time, open it up to some questions for anyone who would like to ask questions or know a little bit more or expand on some of the points. I know there's a few questions in the Q&A box.
I hope you can hear me, Alexandria. Thank you so much to all of you. That was really, I think, a very thorough exploration of both, the challenges in getting the project up, the elements of it, and obviously the results coming from it. And it sounds like an extremely positive experience all round, despite, as you put it, Ian, the extraordinary challenges of trying to run this thing under COVID, and from the sounds of it, an entirely new partnership arrangement for the parties involved, being Bowen and Deakin. So congratulations to all of you and to the rest of your teams for pulling this off, because I think its contribution, it both adds very significantly to our understanding, but also I think affirms a number of directions and thoughts that many of us have been having around these challenges for older people. And it's an area that at the VLF, Nigel and I have discussed on a number of occasions and would like to explore further. But I won't dominate too much. Let's go to the questions that have come in from others. And one, in fact, from our very own principal researcher, Hugh MacDonald, makes a very good point. And this goes to, I think, the phenomenon that we are very familiar with around the clustering of issues that often present. And I think, Alex, you mentioned this right at the top, that people might come in with what appears to be a consumer issue, but is revealed to have an elder abuse dimension to it. And I think, Jordan, you may have mentioned the way in which these things might be flagged in future in order to identify the sort of elder abuse aspects that often sit beneath or alongside other problems that people present with. And Hugh's question is really around whether or not there are trigger problems, that whether or not you saw any particular issues that might be the presenting issue in a higher number than others. And I suppose in my mind that might be consumer or debt financial issues, but obviously very interested to hear your thoughts on that. I don't even know where to put that question. Maybe to Alex first, and then you can shepherd it in whatever appropriate direction.
Sure, thanks, Lynn. In terms of trigger points, I think the two key things we saw were financial and family. So they were the key themes that came out both in our interviews with BCLS staff, in our case reviews, but also in our focus groups with external stakeholders. There was a real sense that there was a real sense that older people were running into issues around financial arrangements, and family were involved. That was kind of the broad brush picture. And as Jordan, I think, flagged for us, we've seen a huge increase in our family violence legal practice, particularly in our duty lawyer service, but in other related areas of family violence legal assistance. And I think family violence is also that trigger. And sometimes having that external intervention at that family violence stage can connect that older person into the legal assistance. It is then that we identify that cluster of problems. And I think for us, we're really excited to really apply and make this research real life. And I think Liz has identified, an integrated partnership is a natural next step using this evidence base we've now got And I think for me, the thing that I've learnt so much about research in this project is that you can know something in a sector, you can kind of understand it theoretically, but to see the research and evidence support that is a really powerful thing. And I think it's really built our confidence as a service to do more research. And now that we've got this sustainable partnership, hopefully going forward with Deakin, we can kind of explore other kind of questions that come up in our legal practice as well.
Would anyone else like to pick up on dimensions there? Oh, okay, I was just pulling along from that, Alex, before we go to other questions that people have put up. To you, Ian, I think despite the ethics challenges at the beginning and getting that through the multiple hoops that tertiary institutions always require, it sounds like a very positive experience all around. Is this something that the university is now more minded to recognising a sort of greater partnership arrangement rather than, the intellectual property challenges that you faced in terms of saying, no, we can't own the data? Do you think they'll be up for this again, is what I'm getting at?
Most definitely. And I think, we ventured into this not knowing the hurdles we were going to have to jump over during the process. And that's coming from someone that does a lot of legally based research, but not a lot of empirical research. So it was a learning curve for me to negotiate ethics committees as part of the procedure. But I think putting my criminological hat on, I'm going to get a little bit more belligerent about this internally. And part of the reason for this is because the partnership model has a co-educational dimension to it that is absolutely crucial for not only the development of our students, but the improvement of such an important service that BCLS provides. And so I've read a lot about everyday law, and in order to enact everyday law, you should also have everyday education. So I think loosening some of those shackles a little bit are very important. And in light of that, I'd just like to throw to any one of the interns to talk about their experience, because I think that's the real crucial point that the university is prizing out of this. So any one of you.
I can start. I also will acknowledge Nigel's sort of question about whether any of us are interested in research. I think I have said this a few times that it is difficult to come to the end of a criminology degree and be, if I haven't had this experience, I wouldn't really know exactly where I wanted to go or what I was necessarily qualified to do. So being able to have this opportunity to really implement all the theory that I've learned throughout the degree and in such an important real world project, and with working with Ian, who has been a teacher, but being able to work a little bit more as a peer, I guess, has been invaluable and something that I really think needs to be built more into courses that maybe aren't as sort of job specific, so that, people have that experience to go out into the real world. Looking at elder abuse or issues of older people as well is something that we don't really even look at uni as well. So I think this project was incredibly important and valuable for me, and just being able to expand my knowledge of different issues that different people face, really.
Shannon, has it made you look at older people differently?
Oh, 100%. Like, to be honest, before this project, I'll probably admit I was quite naive to a lot of the issues that we've discussed today. So yeah, even for me, it's really just been an eye-opening experience. And I'm just so grateful to BCLS and to Ian and everyone, because they've supported us every step of the way. And I know for me in this COVID world and everything, like, the year that we did the internship and everything, all of my other placements and intern opportunities and everything were cancelled. So, you know, to have people who care enough to help us facilitate this internship, like I think I can speak on behalf of all the interns when I say that we're really grateful for the opportunity. And now I would say I'm definitely considering a career in research, probably really not something that I'd ever thought of prior to this, but I think working on a project that, you know, has such real world application and figuring out how passionate I am about it, I've definitely decided that I'd be passionate about a career in research.
That's great to hear. Justin, do you want to complete the set? Make any comment?
Yeah, absolutely. To answer the question about interest in research, I feel research for me was something that I've always been interested in, but to go with what Jordan was sort of saying, there's never been a sort of place to practice that in a real world scenario. It's sort of been based on looking through research and putting that together in a piece to be marked. But to actually find that research yourself and have the knowledge that you're making a difference, you're putting this into something which is going to be really meaningful, I think is really important. And adding on to that, with the degree that I'm doing with criminology and psychological science, there's no inbuilt sort of work experience. So experiences like this internship are just invaluable for getting a taste of what research really is like. And we talked about it a lot in discussion, that research that you do in your assignments at university is completely different to research that you're doing in real life. It's not a linear process. You're pushing back and forth. I think Ian said a couple of times something which really stuck with me. Your literature review is never really finished because there's always new literature coming out. And a great example of that was the ARLC report coming out into elder abuse as we were doing the internship. So information like that coming out. So yeah, that was really good for the experience. And then to add on to what Shannon said, I think doing the research yourself puts a whole new perspective on what you see in your personal life and things that you don't recognize. And so things that you don't recognize, it might be elder abuse or a civil law issue. And I know when I was doing my own research into the literature review, I was sort of like, I've seen this and heard this everywhere, but I never would have thought this to be an elder abuse issue, especially in terms of financial abuse, which is huge, and families. So, and I think it's really good to get this base of research through, because I think that there's a lot of interesting things that can be researched from now on. So I think it's a really good opening point to sort of start the conversation around elder abuse and what can be done to sort of look into the issue a bit more and then make meaningful changes to improve from there on.
Absolutely. Alex said, you know, there is nothing quite as powerful as the data. And I think the satisfaction that you get at the end of a project like this one, having amassed your findings and picked up the sorts of insights that you have, you know, can carry a very long way. So back to you, Alex, in terms of how BCLS is going to use this, the question from Sam Loveridge is, you know, this is a great piece of work, but how will you engage with older consumers in terms of your legal practice? Is there some thinking happening inside BCLS about how you might deliver greater outreach or legal health checks, as Sam suggests, that resonate directly? I mean, I think we've had a number of suggestions about outreach and overcoming the digital divide and the sorts of challenges that we need to overcome to really connect. Have you been thinking about what you do next?
Always, yes. And I think for us, you know, the key missing voice was the voice of older people. And I think if we were, to do this project again, we'd really frame it and work hard around those ethics issues that we encountered. So in terms of next steps, I think, you know, 2022 will be about thinking of really practical ways we can implement this research. Internally, like, I think one of the reasons we did this research was to find our pain points, our limitations within our own data. And I think there's a lot of work we can do around that. But in terms of involving older people, I think getting some information and some focus groups with older people around legal health checks would be a really, really great starting point. And I think it was Sam's question around CALD communities and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I think a real big finding was that you need to have this a tailored place-based approach with priority client groups. So I think particularly thinking hard about how we're engaging with CALD communities and our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities will be big priorities for 2022.
Good, that's great to hear, and maybe we'll check in and see how you're tracking, because this is, I think, it has to be a growth area, with all the positive and negative implications that carries. We are an aging population, and given your cohort in particular in the Barwon catchment, you are the perfect place to explore this more fully. I thought there was a really interesting discussion happening in the chat, as much as I've been able to keep up with it, around the interplay between family violence and elder abuse, and the edges of those two concepts. But I suppose I was interested also, and maybe one of the interns can pick this up by way of your conversations around the interview process, whether or not there was a hesitance in people who are describing the experience of older people, as you were, around the words violence and abuse, and whether or not for an older cohort, those felt like terms that were too strong or too challenging to apply to a family dynamic that they were concerned not to rupture. Did you get any sense of that? I suppose for many of us, the application of the word abuse or violence seems quite justified because that's what it is. But I wondered in older people whether or not there was a reluctance to go there with that kind of language. Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
Justin, you can go first. I jumped in.
I was going to say, it's probably a bit difficult to answer that on behalf of older people because we didn't have that aspect of the research. But from my own experiences, I would think that yes, that is the case with older people, that they might be a bit more reluctant to actually recognise the issue as abuse. And especially with the research, we did find that they are reluctant to, because of the family aspect, a lot of the times they're more looking to keep the family together rather than splitting it apart, and recognizing that as abuse and then pursuing that can in many situations sort of split those families. So that makes it into a really complex issue. So yeah, I think definitely a lot of instances of what is classified as abuse wouldn't be necessarily recognized as that, whether that's through not being aware of what abuse is, or maybe willfully ignoring it to sort of help out in other aspects of life.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from into the focus groups that I ran, in terms of like the key stakeholders, I think people were pretty comfortable with using the term like family violence. Like there was no real shying away from that. Elder abuse or the issues that older people face fall into that category. I would say the only thing I noted was that, yeah, we were comfortable with using the term family violence, family abuse, domestic abuse, but not really separating it out as elder abuse, because there were definitely key differences in how elder abuse occurs, who perpetrates it, how it's perpetrated. And I would say there's not necessarily maybe not acknowledgement, but understanding that it is different, and perhaps needs a bit more nuance around the conversation of elder abuse.
My hunch is that conversation is going to grow over time, and that we will see much more discussion around this, and hopefully therefore a greater awareness and understanding of what those terms mean and how and where to apply them. Ian, coming back to you, Sam's also put up another question about the ethics approval challenge and the ways in which we might reduce the high risk tag that goes to talking directly to older people. I assume that the ethics challenge here was in talking directly to any ordinary person as opposed to service providers. Was that it, or was it specifically about talking to older people?
The key problem here is the term abuse. If it's the stock standard criminological problem. If you put the crime problem at the forefront, you're not going to get what you want. So the question is to actually emphasize the civil law need. So one of the things that I learned during the process was that there's an art to the way in which you frame things. And so, but inevitably, I think it would come up in a whether it's a low risk or a high risk context, that if you're emphasizing civil law need, then at some point the question of elder abuse would come up. So you would have to mitigate that possibility. The only way you can do it is through the services that the universities recommend. So it's through making available counselling services, ensuring that legal advice is provided if you detect a case, and that's potentially followed through. So there's confidentiality requirements associated with it. The only other cohort that I think would be as difficult to interview would be young people under the age of 18. So, and that's taking the issue of the ethical dimension seriously, I think, because you run the risk if you're interviewing someone that you might uncover something that might be problematic. So I don't think we can get away from it. I think we can frame it a bit better so that we can get those narratives out there, because that's the important missing link. And I think, just following the chat, that if you have a stronger narrative that is driven by older people, then you actually unravel some of the stereotypes associated with family violence, abuse, and so forth. So I think our role is to facilitate how to promote that narrative in a way that ethics committees are actually going to be sensitive to.
Good answer. Thanks, Ian. More challenges there on all fronts. But picking up on I think a phrase that Ian used in his presentation, or his part of it, but coming back to Alex, this notion of co-care, which is a lovely phrase. I think I'm going to pinch that, Ian. And I think others mentioned the prospect of a health justice partnership as well. And certainly a number of you have referred to the challenges in finding people where they are and going to the shopping centres, as you put it, Ian, and meeting people where they are, and the outreach prospect. I mean, this, Alex, in terms of running a legal service, is challenging. It's resource intensive. It's a very different model of work. But do you think there is a growing acceptance or embrace that putting law where people need it and where they are is something that we're going to have to really address in the not too distant?
Definitely. Yes, I think it's the way of the future. Place-based justice, integrated partnerships, health justice partnerships. I think it's going to be best practice, and it is best practice already, because we can see that it's reaching really vulnerable cohorts who would never have access to legal help in the first place. And I think that's a really important thing. It's that early intervention model. I think ultimately, with the really serious elder abuse cases, they will ultimately walk through our door at some point. But we want to connect with them earlier. So I think, yes, that co-care model, I love that term, Ian, I'm also going to steal it, is the way of the future. And we got our first health justice partnership funded this year with philanthropic funds targeting people experiencing family violence, but in the maternity and paediatric units. So quite a different cohort of priority clients that might not necessarily be older people, but I think it's a natural progression of that model to look at older people who might have those health needs and who might be in those trusted health settings. I think it is the way of the future.
Well, on that note, unless we have further questions, Nigel, did you have anything you wanted to pick up?
I actually have quite a lot, so maybe we'll save it for a later date. But I mean, I thought it was fascinating. I think it picked up on a lot of core research obsessions around people not seeing legal issues, around holistic services, around things like damage to relationship as barriers. I think we've seen some really interesting stuff, including in the chat from Helen, to do with how we think about elder abuse, how it's defined. And I was kind of intrigued by the stuff Shannon was talking about how do we integrate something practical into the data? You know, do you have as a follow-up to problems, which has always been the research case when we try and look at things like discrimination, where they're not brilliantly understood from the outset. So how do we get to a practical measurement tool in the data? I think that's a really interesting challenge. Yeah, but I mean, as Jordan says, there's clearly a lot of unmet legal need. I mean, proxy measures are exactly that, but there's a lot out there. I thought it was fascinating, and I'd like to see where it goes next, both for Jordan, Shannon and Justin as potential researchers, but also as this is a potential research project. So, you know, is there a way of following up where we give some older people voice in this? Is there a way of speaking to them that'll be able to add some more to it? But yeah, it's great. Thanks very much.
It sure was. And Alex, I think Nigel is aware that this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, the experience of older people. We've been talking about this for years. So I'm so thrilled that you have paved the way and revealed some of the challenges and some of the complexities around language in the first instance, and then you know, all the sort of dimensions of actually measuring this properly and rigorously to really understand what kind of response and service provision would best serve this this aspect of our community better. So thanks again for doing the initial groundwork on that, and congratulations once again to everybody. A really sound piece of work. We are thrilled to have been involved with it and to have offered you the opportunity to go forth and investigate this. Best of luck to all the interns with whatever path you end up taking, and you know, I think that that this experience would set you up well in our world, and we would look forward to contact with you down the track. Alex and Ian, it's been a pleasure, and we will no doubt be in touch again as we wrap the project completely. But thanks to everyone who's attended. The chat has been fast moving and really interesting in itself. I hope you've had a chance to follow some of the commentary there. Obviously, please continue the discussion and the debate around this. We will forward the recording of the discussion to everybody so that you can either view it again, you know, to just while away your evening hours, or you can forward it to your colleagues and friends. And don't forget, of course, that we'll be back with another series of Research Network events from the Victoria Law Foundation in 2022. Given that I probably won't see you again between here and New Year, please go well, stay safe over the summer, enjoy the post-lockdown freedoms, and thanks again for coming. Cheers.